After saving the company, the CEO's son tried to ruin me. What he didn't know was, I was just getting started. He fired on stage in front of investors. This was the moment I vowed to take back what was mine. Join me as I uncover corporate power dynamics and the importance of integrity. The company I had dedicated my career to, I remember when it was on the brink of collapse. Market share was plummeting, clients were leaving, and our finances were going down the drain. The boardroom, once a place of strategy and vision, now felt like a battleground. Jacob, the CEO's son, entered with his usual air of entitlement, offering nothing but vague promises of growth and vision, words we had heard 1,000 times before. But this time, I knew the company's survival didn't rest in his hands. It lay in mine. I had seen what needed to be done, a complete overhaul of the company's operations and technology. The old systems weren't working, and nothing short of radical change would save us. With the board desperate and Jacob distracted, I stood up, knowing I was risking everything. We need a complete overhaul, I said. Not more meetings or half-baked strategies. The company is on the brink, and we can't keep running it like we always have. We need to change everything. The room was silent, filled with skepticism, but I laid out the cold, hard numbers. Losses, client departures, and the undeniable truth that inaction would lead to failure. After a tense moment, Jacob reluctantly agreed, giving me 6 months to turn things around. 6 months. The pressure was immense, but I knew this was my chance to prove not only to them, but to myself, that I could save the company. I couldn't afford to fail. I wouldn't. With the weight of the company's future in my hands, I dove into the work. Days blurred into nights as I and my team implemented new technologies, streamlined the operations, and restructured the core of the company. Every small victory felt like a step toward the inevitable. The company was slowly being pulled from the disaster. But in the background, there was a storm brewing. Jacob, who had always seen himself as the heir, began to grow uncomfortable with my leadership. I had saved the company, and in doing so, I had indirectly made it clear that it wasn't his inherited position that made him worthy. It was the results. And Jacob was not used to being overshadowed. His arrogance began to sour into something darker, jealousy. And when it came to Jacob, jealousy meant trouble. Jacob had always existed in the shadows, the heir apparent to a throne he had done nothing to earn. He had never been forced to prove himself. His father's name, his polished smile, and his position as the son of the CEO had been enough to carry him through. His life was a series of privileges, a cushy office, a lavish lifestyle, and the expectation that one day, when the time came, he would seamlessly step into the role of leader. But now, as the company began to rebound under my guidance, the carefully constructed world Jacob had lived in was starting to crack. He wasn't used to being sidelined, especially not by someone like me, a worker, a problem solver, someone who had worked my way up from the ground level while he had coasted on his name. Jacob had always been content to play the part of the passive heir, never putting himself on the line, never risking failure. But in the wake of my success, the air around him had changed. Jacob's response was almost immediate: resentment. He hadn't earned the respect of the company, and he certainly hadn't earned the right to lead, not like I had. But to admit, that would be to admit he wasn't as capable as the title of CEO's son made him appear. So, he resorted to something far more dangerous: manipulation. The whispers began as nothing more than a murmur in the corners of the office, dismissed by most, but there was something insidious about them. "Is she getting too much credit?" they asked behind my back. "Does she think she's going to take over?" These weren't innocent questions. They were planted, deliberate, meant to sow seeds of doubt among my colleagues. It wasn't just the whispers. I started noticing the subtle shifts in the office dynamics. Jacob's loyalists, many of whom had held positions of influence in the company long before my arrival, began to hedge their bets. They started withdrawing their support from me, aligning themselves with Jacob, the golden child. Their loyalty was a game of convenience, and they were quickly making the calculation that Jacob might be the safer bet after all. It was clear now. Jacob was no longer content with watching from the sidelines. He wasn't willing to let me save the company, let alone take the credit for it. In meetings, I could feel his eyes on me, cold and calculating. His gaze never wavered, like a predator waiting for me to show a weakness. The worst part was the silence. Jacob wasn't the type to make a scene. No, he preferred the slow burn. He would sit in those meetings, barely speaking, watching my every move with a cold, scrutinizing gaze. He knew that the more I succeeded, the more his position would come into question. Despite his cold stare, I refused to falter. I kept my focus on the work at hand. Every day, I drove forward with the same relentless energy, each victory, no matter how small, a step toward saving the company. As the months passed, profits began to rise. Clients, once lost, returned. And yet, Jacob's manipulation was like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. The attacks were subtle at first. During a meeting, one of Jacob's allies, someone who had been a staunch supporter of his father, made a comment about the changes I had implemented. "Isn't it too risky?" they asked. "What if this is just a temporary spike?" It was a question posed under the guise of concern, but I knew it for what it was, a subtle attempt to plant doubt. But I didn't rise to the bait. I held my ground, refuting the claim with facts and figures. Still, I could feel the tension building, the quiet animosity in the room growing stronger. The doubt Jacob had seeded was starting to take root, but it didn't stop there. The turning point came during a particularly heated board meeting. I had just finished presenting our financial results. Positive growth, increased productivity, the beginnings of a long-term recovery. But as I finished speaking, Jacob, who had been silent for most of the meeting, spoke up. His words were carefully measured, and his voice was cool, but there was venom behind them. "While it's impressive," Jacob began, "we can't ignore the risks. We've seen some improvement, yes, but there's no guarantee it will last." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a cloud of doubt. "Are we really putting all our eggs in one basket with these changes? What's the long-term plan?" His words weren't just a critique, they were a public challenge. A challenge to everything I had worked for, everything I had put in motion to save the company. It wasn't just about the numbers anymore. It was about power. Jacob was trying to chip away at my credibility, trying to undercut my efforts in front of the entire board. He was positioning himself as the only one who could lead the company, despite the fact that he had done nothing to prove himself capable. In that moment, I knew exactly what was happening. Jacob was scared. He had never been in a position where he had to fight for control, where his power was questioned. Now, with the company on the rise and my work being recognized, Jacob's grip on the future of the company was slipping. He was trying to claw his way back to relevance, and he didn't care who got hurt in the process. But what he didn't understand was that I wasn't just trying to save the company for my own sake. I was doing it for everyone. For the employees who had worked tirelessly through the darkest days, for the clients who had placed their trust in us, and most importantly, for the future of the company itself. I wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't going to let Jacob's petty games take me down. Despite Jacob's attempts to undermine me, I continued to push forward. The company's recovery was too important to allow his jealousy to derail everything. But I couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. Jacob wasn't done yet. The tension between us grew with every passing day, and it was only a matter of time before he made his move, one that would attempt to destroy everything I had worked for. But little did he know, I wasn't going to let him win that easily. It was coming. I could feel it. Jacob, emboldened by the new alliances he had forged and the power he believed was rightfully his, was preparing to make his move. He couldn't let me continue to steer the ship. His pride wouldn't allow it. And when he made his play, it would be a move that could either make or break everything I had built. The moment I had feared was approaching, and I had no choice but to brace for impact. The annual company summit was supposed to be the event of the year, the pinnacle of our efforts, the time when we could stand proudly before investors, executives, and the press to showcase the tremendous recovery the company had made. It was a chance for all of us to bask in the glory of our hard work, to celebrate our success after months of grueling transformation. The summit was always an opportunity to highlight new partnerships, technological breakthroughs, and the future vision for the company. It was our night to shine. But for me, that night turned into a nightmare. As I prepared for my speech, there was a palpable energy in the air. I'd spent months perfecting the details of our recovery, the numbers, the strategies, the innovations we had implemented to turn the company around. It was all coming together. I could already picture the satisfaction in the eyes of the investors and the applause from the crowd as I outlined how we had gone from the brink of collapse to profitability. I was on the verge of finally earning the recognition I had deserved for so long. But behind the scenes, Jacob was already setting the stage for my fall. What was supposed to be a night of victory would soon turn into an orchestrated attack, a public spectacle designed to strip me of everything I had worked for. Jacob had made sure that the board members were already aligned with him. His allies had whispered their doubts about me, painting me as a threat to the company's future. Behind closed doors, they had already decided that I would be the scapegoat. The trap had been set, and the bait was me. As I walked onto the stage, the bright lights temporarily blinded me. The buzz of conversation faded to a dull hum as I adjusted the microphone, feeling the weight of the audience's gaze on me. I could see Jacob in the front row, his face obscured by a smug smile. He looked confident, even relaxed, as if he already knew what was coming. What he didn't realize, though, was that I had already prepared myself for anything, or so I thought. I started my speech with the usual excitement, touching on the milestones we had reached and the progress we had made. I could see the faces of the executives, the investors, the press. They were all watching closely, some with approval, others with guarded skepticism. I had worked for this moment for so long, and now it was finally here. But as I spoke, my mind started to race. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, the tightening of my chest, the unease creeping into my bones. And then it happened. Jacob stood up suddenly, cutting through my speech. His voice rang out in the hall, confident and commanding. "It's time for new leadership," Jacob declared, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "This company needs a fresh vision, someone with the strength to lead us forward into the future. I'm afraid the current leadership is no longer viable." His words were like a slap in the face. The crowd went silent as he turned to face me, his eyes locked onto mine with an almost predatory look. I felt a cold rush of fear, then anger. This wasn't just a resignation. It wasn't a simple move to shift responsibilities. No, this was a public execution of everything I had worked for. Before I could even process the enormity of what was happening, he dropped the bombshell. "Effective immediately," he continued, his voice dripping with calculated indifference. "I'm removing Sandra from their position as marketing team lead and will appoint a more suitable candidate." It was a shock. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In front of 2,000 guests, Jacob had not just fired me, but stripped me of everything: my hard work, my dignity, my career. The applause that followed his announcement felt like a slap across the face. It wasn't the polite clapping of supporters. It was a cold, resounding judgment. The camera flashes burned into my skin, each flash an assault, each click a reminder of my fall from grace. The room spun, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But no, there he was, standing there with his arms crossed, as though he had just done something noble. The crowd's applause echoed in my ears, the sound of people who didn't know the truth, who didn't understand what had just happened. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. I had been betrayed, not just by Jacob, but by everyone who had silently allowed this to happen. In that moment, I stood there on stage, stunned. The realization hit me like a freight train. I had been blindsided. But somehow, I managed to keep my composure. I knew what he was trying to do: strip me of my confidence, diminish my worth in front of the entire industry. He wanted to humiliate me, to publicly show that I was nothing without his name, his power. He wanted to make sure everyone knew that he was the one in control as the heir now, not me as an ordinary worker. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. I didn't let my anger show, not on the outside. Inside, I was raging. Inside, I wanted to lash out, to tear down everything he had built, to expose him for the coward he was. But in that moment, I kept calm. I couldn't let him see that I was rattled. I couldn't let him see that he had succeeded in what he had set out to do. I turned on my heel and walked off the stage, my head held high, my steps measured. Every inch of me screamed to do something, anything, but I held it together. There was no point in giving him the power he so desperately craved. The room had seen the spectacle, the betrayal, and now it was up to me to decide how I would respond. Jacob thought he had won. He thought that by publicly humiliating me, he could break me. He thought that by firing me in front of everyone, he had made a statement that would send me into hiding, never to challenge him again. But what he didn't know was that this humiliation wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The world had just seen the depths of his insecurity, his desperation, and his willingness to destroy everything to claim what he felt was his birthright. But what Jacob didn't realize was that in his attempt to ruin me, he had just made a grave mistake. He had underestimated me, and now I had the perfect platform to rise from the ashes. Jacob thought he could bury me with a few words, a public spectacle that would strip me of my dignity. But what he didn't realize was that I had a plan that would turn his public attack into the very thing that would bring him down. What he thought was my end was, in fact, the catalyst for my revenge. As I walked off the stage that night, my head held high, a sense of surreal clarity washed over me. The world had witnessed my public humiliation, but I could feel something deeper stirring within me. The applause that had followed Jacob's declaration, his cruel announcement of my firing, still echoed in my ears. The cameras had flashed, the crowd had murmured, and for a brief moment, I could almost convince myself that I had lost everything. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that the stage lights had barely dimmed, and Jacob's victory was already fading. I had been knocked down, yes, but I wasn't out. I was only just beginning. The humiliation? It was nothing more than fuel. Jacob had underestimated me, and for that, he would pay dearly. His petty attempt to dismantle me, to strip away everything I had fought for, would not go unpunished. I was going to reclaim everything. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was mine. It was about taking back control, about showing the world that I would rise from this. The bitterness of his betrayal still burned in my chest, but I pushed it down. The fire it sparked wasn't going to consume me. It was going to propel me forward. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. Jacob's arrogance, his belief that he could simply sweep me aside, only made him more vulnerable. I wasn't the only one who had been hurt by this. I wasn't alone. I have loyalists. I knew who I had to turn to next. I called on my allies. They were the ones who had seen the work I'd put in behind the scenes, the sacrifices I'd made, the long hours I'd spent pulling the company back from the brink. They knew I had been the driving force behind the recovery. I was no longer going to stand on the sidelines and watch Jacob tear it all apart. I was going to take charge not just of my future, but of the company's future. My former colleagues, friends who had remained loyal through the highs and lows, were on my side. Legal experts who had seen the injustice of my public dismissal rallied behind me. Together we formed a coalition, a team of like-minded individuals who recognized that Jacob's actions weren't just a personal attack on me. They were a threat to everything we had worked for. This was no longer just about one person's ambitions. It was about the integrity of the company and the future of everyone who depended on it. I know he never imagined something like this was possible, but before we could strike, we needed to gather all the information to ensure that we had a rock-solid plan in place. The first thing I did was dive into the company's contracts, every agreement signed under the previous regime. It was a daunting task, pages upon pages of legal jargon and clauses. But I had done this before. I knew how to navigate the complexities. The more I read, the more I realized that Jacob had overlooked something. He had made a fatal mistake. The software that had saved the company, the tool that had pulled us out of the hole Jacob had dug for us, was mine. The intellectual property rights were clearly stated, and the ownership was undisputed. It was mine, not his. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that Jacob had not only fired me without cause, he had also overlooked the very thing that held the company together. The very thing that made him believe he had control. Jacob had given me the one thing I needed to take back everything: leverage. As I sat there reading through the contracts, the pieces clicked into place. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't just a victim in this story. Jacob may have fired me, but he had failed to account for one crucial factor. The software wasn't just a tool to help the company recover. It was the key to unlocking everything. Without it, without me, the company would crumble. The more I thought about it, the clearer the path became. I wasn't just going to get back my career, I was going to take back the company. I would expose Jacob for the manipulator he was, show the world his lack of vision, his desperation, and most importantly, his incompetence. This wasn't going to be a quiet takeover. No, this was going to be a calculated public move, one that would strip Jacob of his ill-gotten power. I would play my cards carefully, but I would play them boldly. I couldn't afford to let him think that he had won. I couldn't let anyone believe that he was the future of the company. Jacob's reliance on his family name, his arrogance, had made him blind to the realities of what kept the company running. He believed he could pull the rug out from under me and walk away unscathed. He thought that with one swift action, he could erase all that I had done. But what he hadn't realized was that I had already set the wheels in motion. The company's future was tied to me, and he would soon find that out the hard way. It wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about taking back control for the sake of power. It was about doing what was right. The company had been saved because of my decisions, my hard work, and my dedication. Jacob had been living in the shadow of his father, relying on the wealth and influence of his last name. He had no true understanding of what it took to lead, to build, and to grow from scratch. But I did. And it was time for everyone to see that. I began preparing. I knew I had to strike fast and decisively. My allies were already working on gathering the evidence we needed, laying the groundwork for the legal and financial moves that would expose Jacob's lack of foresight. But we needed one more piece to ensure that we had the upper hand. I wasn't going to make the same mistake Jacob had. I wasn't going to act out of anger or frustration. I was going to be methodical. I was going to make sure that every move I made was calculated, and that Jacob would have no way out. As the days passed, my resolve hardened. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that this was not just about me. This was about everyone who had been working under Jacob's shadow, everyone who had been silenced and disregarded because they weren't born with a silver spoon in their mouth. I wasn't just fighting for my career, I was fighting for the future of the company, for everyone who had believed in the work we had done. But Jacob, with all his power and influence, wasn't going to go down without a fight. I knew that, and that made this even more satisfying. The stage was set, and the battle lines were drawn. This was no longer just a power struggle between two people. It was about taking back what was rightfully mine, what had been stolen from me, and proving that hard work, vision, and integrity always trumped arrogance and privilege. The time had come to take action. I had spent enough time strategizing, gathering the pieces of the puzzle. Now it was time to show Jacob the true cost of his betrayal. There was no turning back. He thought he had won, but in reality, he had just signed his own downfall. And I was ready to watch it unfold. Nothing would stop me now. The final showdown arrived faster than I thought. The tension in the boardroom was palpable, the moment that would either define my future or irreversibly destroy everything I had worked for. I had spent months preparing for this, carefully crafting every detail, every strategy that would bring Jacob down. It was no longer just about my career. It was about reclaiming my rightful place, about showing everyone that I was not someone to be underestimated. I knew what I had to do. The The meeting with the investors was supposed to be a celebration of Jacob's vision. He had convinced everyone, almost everyone, that he was the one who could lead the company to new heights. His expression was polished, his charisma undeniable. He stood there with the confidence of a man who thought he had already won, but what he didn't realize was that his reign was built on nothing but manipulation, privilege, and a staggering lack of vision. As I walked into that room, I wasn't there to plead, to beg, or to grovel for my position back. I wasn't there to ask for forgiveness. I had already made up my mind. This was the moment I would take back everything, and I would do it in front of the people who had the power to decide the company's future. Jacob stood at the front of the room, surrounded by investors, board members, and a handful of reporters who had been invited to cover the event. His familiar smugness was on full display, as though he were the king of the world. He was ready to push through his vision for the company, a vision that lacked depth, that was void of real solutions. It was a vision that had almost ruined us before. But Jacob couldn't see that. He never saw beyond his own arrogance. As I sat down in the chair across from him, I could feel the eyes of the room on me. They were waiting for me to speak, expecting me to cower or defend myself, perhaps even apologize, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. I waited for the moment when Jacob took his seat, believing he had everything under control. It was then that I rose to my feet. The room fell silent. Every eye was on me. I took a deep breath, not out of fear, but to steady myself for what I was about to do. This was the culmination of everything, every late night, every sleepless hour, every sacrifice. It was time to expose Jacob for what he truly was. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I went straight to the heart of it. Projector displaying my achievement and proof of work in the boardroom. Jacob's so-called vision, I began, my voice steady but carrying the weight of the truth, is nothing but a series of empty promises, a mirage built on privilege and manipulation. He lacks the understanding, the foresight, and the integrity to guide this company into the future. The investors exchanged nervous glances. Jacob's expression faltered for a split second. That was all it took. I saw the crack in his perfect facade, and I pressed on. Let me remind you, I continued, of what I actually did to save this company. I wasn't handed anything. I built it from the ground up, from the mess Jacob left us in, and I did it with hard work and innovation. This company's success wasn't due to a last name. It was due to the efforts of those who believed in something real, something sustainable, and Jacob's failure to recognize that is why we're here today. The silence in the room was deafening. No one had ever spoken to Jacob like this before. The people in the room had either been too afraid to challenge him or too blinded by his family's name to see the truth. But I wasn't afraid, and I wasn't going to let them continue living in this delusion. Jacob's face was flushed now, his jaw clenched, and I could see the panic beginning to creep into his eyes. He had never been challenged like this in front of the people he thought he controlled. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. This isn't about my ego. This is about the future of the company. You think you can walk in here, fire me, and take control as if the last 2 years never happened? As if the recovery I spearheaded didn't bring us back from the brink of collapse? You're wrong, Jacob. The company belongs to those who built it, and you can't manipulate your way out of the truth. The investors were now watching him more closely than they had ever done before. Jacob, still trying to regain control, stammered. He tried to speak over me, to take the floor, but his voice cracked under the weight of the truth I had just exposed. And bad for him, he won't risk acting carelessly or aggressively in front of several media coverage. Jacob, I said, my voice rising with certainty, you are nothing without the company, and the company as it stands has no future under your leadership. It's time to face the facts. The room was frozen. The tension was so thick I could almost taste it. Jacob's empire, built on arrogance and inherited privilege, was crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His control over the board had shattered, and the investors, now seeing through his thin veneer, began to murmur among themselves, and they even threatened to pull out of all their investments, else I was retained and honored. It was in that moment, as I looked around the room, that I realized how far I had come. This wasn't just a victory over Jacob. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced by the powerful few who thought they could control everything. It was a victory for the employees who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, the ones who had built the company just as much as I had. Jacob tried to speak again, but I wasn't going to let him have the last word. The damage had already been done. His public power play had backfired. The investors, once under his thumb, were now beginning to question his judgment, his ability to lead. And that was the moment I had been waiting for. I didn't just expose Jacob's incompetence. I had also secured the future of the company. I had already locked in my support from key investors, and I had regained control of the narrative. No longer would the company be a pawn in Jacob's manipulative games. I had made sure of that. The press, who had been quietly recording the entire exchange, had captured every moment of Jacob's humiliation. The headlines the next day would tell the world everything they needed to know. Company savior exposed as fraud. Jacob's manipulation crumbles in public showdown. It was all there for the world to see, and in that moment, Jacob knew he had lost. As the meeting drew to a close, I stood tall, feeling the weight of my triumph. Jacob's smirk had been replaced by a look of defeat. He knew there was no coming back from this. His carefully constructed empire had crumbled, and he was left with nothing but his name. I didn't need to say another word. I had already said everything I needed to. In that moment, I realized that the humiliation I had endured, the public disgrace, had been the catalyst I needed. It had sharpened my resolve, honed my focus, and made me stronger than I had ever been before. The lesson was clear. You can never truly silence someone who is determined to rise again. And now, I have. As Jacob's fall echoed throughout the company, I turned my attention to what lay ahead. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. With the company's future firmly in my hands, it was time to rebuild, this time on my terms. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.